Today, I'm talking with Howard Stein and Seth Allcorn about their new book, Psychoanalytic Insights into Social, Political, and Organizational Dynamics Understanding the Age of Trump. This book is the culmination of a series of papers that Seth and Howard began writing together in 2015. Their goal? To make sense of what was happening in the social and political realm that paved the way to the ascendance of Donald Trump to the presidency. Good morning, Seth and
Good
Howard.
morning.
Thanks for being here with me again today to talk about your new book. So, one of the main contributions of the book is its systemic analysis. Tell us about your overall approach in the book.
So Howard and I, as we uh, worked on trying to understand the age of Trump, we located the fact that there was a lot of psychosocial and political complexity within Trump himself and relative to his followers who are very loyal. So we decided to basically use a triangulation approach that was about Trump himself initially, and then about his the larger context in which he was operating. So we designed a triangle inside of a triangle to basically visualize our approach of triangulation. And the inner triangle was about Trump himself and his business experience, his really apparent narcissism, many people comment on and write about, and his self-presentation as an autocrat or an authoritarian who often had qualities that resembled a mob boss in terms of how he acted relative to taking out his enemies. We triangulated, Trump with his the larger context where he has many followers who have a long list of grievances that he basically represents and articulates and obviously exploits to his benefit. And he is also seen, I think, by his followers as a charismatic leader and willing to pursue their interests aggressively, which has strongly bonded them to him as a leader. The third corner of the context triangle is the notion of right-wing ideologies, which Trump has pursued, which were consistent to some extent with regular Republican ideologies. And but at the same time, by doing so, he bonded a lot of people to him for example, cutting taxes and deregulating a great many things, including, say, the environment and its protection. So the other thing, of course, that he did with dog whistles was he bonded white supremacists and white nationalists to him, and using in particular constant reference to building the wall. So the two triangles together basically are an effort to explore in a more systematic way the age of Trump. And it was a challenging project for us to work on, but I think, came up with a very workable approach.
So, Howard, what are your thoughts on the triangulation approach?
Um, I think it's important to distinguish between triangle and triangulation. A triangle is a static geometric figure that there are three apices. Triangulation is a verb. And what we mean by that, well, triangulation can be used as noun and verb. It is a process in which all of these 3 points and the triangulation within triangulation is a very dynamic process. And so it's not simply 3 points that are always in the same place. There's constant movement. And what we're trying to do is to develop, I want to call it psychoanalytic systems theory, to understand the age of Trump. And the systems theory encompasses so many of the disciplines that are obvious from what Seth has just said. And the question is, how do they get related? And how do they help us understand the age, not only of the individual person, Donald Trump, but of the complex relationships, starting out economic and then political, and virtually every discipline. I think my point of departure in looking at a systematic way of looking at this triangulation is to pull back for a second and look at the notion of individual psychology and individual psychodynamics, not only about Trump, but in the West. Certainly, I accept the notion that each individual has unconscious processes, and that is a large part of what makes up human nature. But it is very common, including among psychoanalysts, to look at one person at a time, so that when we look at Donald Trump, we will look at character traits, narcissism, authoritarianism, the connection between narcissistic injury to self-esteem, and intense shame, and then in turn, a violent reaction to the person who injured him. And it is easy in, first of all, the Western intellectual tradition, and then even within psychoanalysis, to reduce everything to the psychodynamics and the individual development of Donald Trump. For instance, his father being a very dominating, prominent figure, and maybe we could say psychologically abusive. It was very difficult for Donald to live up to that. And so he went through repetitive cycles of self-aggrandizement, failure in the world, being one of the world's great salesmen and persuading people that he was far greater than he actually was. And think of those in terms of individual properties. There's a lot of books that have been written about this. The problem is Donald Trump didn't just do it all himself. There's a big difference between, let's say, a state psychiatric hospital backwards psychotic who has his own or her own hallucinations, delusions, and that sort of thing, and someone who is able to project those onto people who welcome them and say, you're not crazy, you're our savior. So that in order to understand Trump, we must understand the so-called word intersubjectivity, the relationship between unconscious of, of Donald Trump and that of his followers, the sycophants, his base, a lot of the Republicans in the House and Senate, um, people he's trying to pack into the Supreme Court, etc. And so we end up looking at a dynamic of not only Donald Trump's individual narcissism, but how he feeds the sense of narcissistic injury on the part of a lot of uh, poor white folk, uh, whether from the South or people who have been kicked out of uh, lifetime, almost long jobs in the age of downsizing and reengineering in the Rust Belt, um, and people who are aggrieved. The only thing that differentiates them from others is race. And so that it is as if to say, we have we have everything else in common with them, but we're better because we're white. And that injury feeds into Trump's need to be aggrandized, and that feeds in turn to inflating them and making them feel better. So the question then is, if we're looking at the character trait of Donald Trump's narcissism, whose narcissism are we talking about? Obviously, it's, quote, everyone's, but it's a systemic narcissism that draws upon the needs and the frailties and the exploitation of all of them.
Their writing has been a way to both make sense of current events for themselves and to share their thoughts in a way that connects with readers, inspires understanding, and makes concepts and ideas available that can make sense in everyday life. They told me that they consider this book an invitation for discovery. How does what they write remind you of your own life? Does what they have to say fit with your experience and observations? And are you inspired to think more deeply about what's happening in the world today? They hope that you'll say yes.